She hadn't spoken a single word in 9 years until the day her father came back from the dead. The house had stood quiet for 9 years, its porch sagging under the weight of forgotten time, its windows covered in a layer of dust so thick it turned sunlight into shadow. When Cal Dawson stepped out of his pickup truck and looked at the place he once called home, he didn't feel relief or nostalgia, only guilt sharp and suffocating. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and old wood, and somewhere inside he knew his daughter Grace still lived. She had been only 2 when her mother died, and Cal, unable to bear the grief, had walked away, leaving behind a child too young to understand loss, and a silence that had grown louder with every passing year. Now, 11, Grace hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. Everyone in the town whispered about her, the girl who wouldn't talk, the father who vanished. But Cal didn't come back for forgiveness or explanations. He came back because of a promise left scribbled in the final page of Lily's journal, a plea wrapped in fading ink. Please don't leave her behind too. Cal Dawson hadn't set foot on the property in nearly a decade, and yet the moment his boots crunched against the gravel of the old driveway, it felt like every year he'd been gone came crashing down on him at once. The house stood at the edge of the Kentucky woods, leaning slightly as if age and grief had bent its spine. The front steps sagging the shutters, weather-worn paint peeled like dried skin. Nothing had changed. That was what startled him most. The ivy still clawed up the left side of the porch where Lily once tried in vain to plant morning glories. The porch swing still hung by one rusted chain, creaking as the breeze passed through. Cal stood motionless, keys in hand, heart pounding with the weight of memory and regret. He had left the day after Lily's funeral, too hollow to be a father, too ashamed to stay. Grace had been just 2 years old, barely walking, barely talking, but even then she had looked at him with eyes that understood abandonment more clearly than any child should. Now she was 11, and she was still here. He wasn't sure if she'd recognize him. Maybe she wouldn't want to. Maybe she hadn't forgiven him. He hadn't forgiven himself. The house had become a shell of what it once was, and so had he. Cal ran his fingers along the edge of the porch rail dust, blooming in the late afternoon light like ghosts. The air smelled of decaying leaves, damp wood, and something faintly sweet lilac. No memory. The door creaked open before he could knock. Miss Evelyn stood there, her frame smaller than he remembered, her face weathered but sharp like the truth. She didn't say a word, just stepped aside, letting him in. Inside, the silence was thick. No laughter, no footsteps, just the ticking of a distant clock. The walls were still lined with Lily's framed photos, some crooked, some dust-covered, all watching him. And then he saw her. Grace, sitting on the floor beside the cold fireplace, drawing with a stub of charcoal. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She simply kept drawing the line, sharp and careful, as if each stroke was a sentence she didn't dare speak aloud. Cal wanted to speak God, he did, but the lump in his throat was thick as stone. Instead, he stepped forward slowly into the house he had abandoned, into the life he had once buried. Grace Dawson sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the same floor where her mother used to stretch out a blanket for afternoon picnics when the sunlight poured in just right. Now dust floated through the heavy air like slow-falling snow, and Grace barely seemed to breathe. She held a short piece of charcoal in her fingers, her nails rimmed with black, her hands steady, as she drew line after line onto a torn piece of cardboard. Her brow furrowed with the kind of focus that made her seem older than 11, as if each mark carried a weight only she understood. She hadn't spoken a word in 9 years, not since the day they buried her mother in the churchyard behind the ridge. No one could explain why. The doctors called it selective mutism. The therapists said it was trauma. But the town just whispered, "That poor girl, she's still broken." She had learned to communicate through sketches, through glances, through the silence that others found unnerving, but that she wore like a second skin. Cal stood just inside the doorway, his breath caught in his chest as he looked at her. This fragile stranger who was also his daughter. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence, and part of him wondered if that was her punishment for him, silence so deep it mirrored his own cowardice. Miss Evelyn crossed the room quietly and placed a warm mug of cocoa beside Grace, who nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before returning to her drawing. The picture was of a house not unlike this one, with a small figure standing alone on the porch, and a larger figure just beyond the trees, shadowed and distant. Cal's heart clenched. Was that him, or was that what she remembered of him? He wanted to kneel beside her to say her name, to whisper that he was sorry, but the words tasted useless, dry and hollow. Instead, he sat down in the old armchair across the room, its cushions sunken and familiar, and watched her like a man seeing a miracle he didn't deserve. Grace continued drawing, unaware or uncaring of his presence, her silence louder than any scream. In that moment, Cal understood something brutal and true. Rebuilding would not begin with words. It would begin with waiting, with staying, with proving day after day that he would not leave again. Miss Evelyn had been the housekeeper for the Dawson family since before Grace was born, but when Lily died and Cal disappeared, no one expected her to stay. She wasn't paid. There were no relatives asking her to keep watch. The town assumed she'd pack her things and return to her sister's farm upstate, but Miss Evelyn stayed quietly, stubbornly, and without explanation. She cleaned the rooms, cooked simple meals, fixed the creaking pipes when winter threatened to freeze them, and most of all, she took care of Grace. At first, the girl barely acknowledged her, staring out the window for hours as if waiting for something that never came. But Evelyn wasn't there for gratitude. She moved through the house like a ghost with a purpose, folding laundry, lighting the stove, tucking blankets around the child at night, her hands steady and worn from decades of labor. She never told Grace what to feel, never asked her to speak. Instead, she sat beside her during storms, held her hand during doctor visits, and taught her how to make cornbread from scratch, because Lily used to say the scent of it made the house feel warm, even in the dead of winter. She answered to no one and expected nothing in return. When neighbors asked why she hadn't left, she'd shrug and say, "Some promises don't need to be spoken to be kept." The truth was, she had loved Lily like a daughter, and after watching her die piece by piece, Evelyn couldn't bear the thought of that child being left behind, not again. So she stayed. She paid the property taxes from her late husband's pension, planted tomatoes in the backyard, and called the town clerk once a month to pick up donated groceries. Grace had grown in that silence, and though she still did not speak, she began to hum. Quietly at first, just a single note while stirring soup or brushing her hair. But Evelyn heard it, and it was enough. Now, seeing Cal in the doorway, Evelyn neither welcomed nor condemned him. She simply handed him a cup of black coffee as if he'd only stepped out for the afternoon and said, "If you're here to stay, you'd better learn how to fix that back door hinge. Been dragging for months." Her voice was firm, her eyes unreadable, and in that moment, Cal realized something deeper than shame. Miss Evelyn had never left, not because she couldn't, but because someone had to stay. The air inside the Dawson house felt thicker than it should have, like grief had soaked into the very walls and refused to let go. Every surface was veiled in a layer of dust that dulled the colors of once-loved furniture and blurred the outlines of picture frames that hadn't been touched in years. Even the light, what little of it managed to slip past the warped curtains, fell in muted streaks, casting long, tired shadows across the wooden floorboards. A cracked clock hung frozen above the fireplace, its hands forever stuck. At 2:17, a moment lost in time, a house stopped mid-breath. The silence was the kind that pressed against the chest, not peaceful, but suffocating, like it didn't want anyone to speak, to move, to disturb what had settled here. Cal's boots made the faintest creak as he walked across the floor, but the sound died, quickly swallowed whole by the stillness. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt wood and aging paper. A tea towel, stiff from disuse, hung from a hook beside the sink. Dishes sat clean but untouched in the drying rack, as if waiting for hands that had long since disappeared. Upstairs, the door to the master bedroom remained closed. Cal hadn't opened it. He couldn't yet. The hallway leading to it was darker than the rest of the house and colder somehow, like even the air knew better than to wander there. Miss Evelyn moved quietly, as she always did, her footsteps barely audible on the creaky floorboards. She didn't speak unless necessary, and Grace said nothing at all. The only sound that occasionally stirred the silence was the whisper of wind through the cracked window panes or the soft rustle of paper as Grace drew. The house groaned, sometimes wood contracting and the night pipes shifting with temperature, but even those noises seemed hesitant, like intrusions into a world that had chosen stillness over healing. Outside, the trees pressed in around the property branches, skeletal against the gray sky. No birds sang, no cars passed. It was as if time had forgotten this place entirely, or perhaps chosen to leave it untouched out of respect for what had been lost. This wasn't a home. It was a shrine of absence, of things left unsaid and undone, wrapped in dust and silence. And yet in the midst of all that weight, Cal felt the faintest pull, not of hope, not yet, but of reckoning. Something had to break. And soon. Cal stood at the end of the narrow hallway, staring at the door that hadn't been touched in 9 years. The wood, once polished with Lily's lavender oil, had faded to a dull gray, the handle slightly rusted from years of humidity and neglect. Dust clung to the baseboards and drifted lazily in the stale air, catching the faint light from the hallway like suspended ash. His hand hovered inches from the doorknob, trembling slightly, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. Behind that door was everything he had run from: the scent of her hair on the pillow, the cardigan she draped over the rocking chair, the diary she kept tucked under the nightstand, the empty pill bottles hidden deep in the drawer, the echo of her voice in the quiet hours of the night. He had carried the weight of her death like a secret too heavy to speak of, too dangerous to look at directly. When Lily died, the house didn't just fall silent, it fractured. Grace had stopped talking. Evelyn had stopped aging, frozen in duty. And Cal, he had stopped living. He told himself that walking away had been mercy for Grace, for the house, for himself. But now, with each breath he took at the threshold of that room, he realized it had only been cowardice. The air here smelled different, stale, untouched, sacred. A single line of light spilled from the small gap between the door and the frame dust, shimmering like fireflies in a frozen moment. His heart thudded so loudly it seemed to fill the hall, drowning out everything else. He reached for the doorknob again, stopped, then lowered his hand. He wasn't ready. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The memory of her voice came back to him, then soft and worn from illness, but still strong in spirit. "Promise me, Cal, don't let her grow up alone." He had broken that promise the minute he left. The guilt burned behind his eyes, sharp and familiar. He placed a calloused hand against the door, closed his eyes, and stood there in silence, as if bracing for a voice that would never answer. The house creaked behind him, but nothing stirred from within. He turned away slowly, unable to cross that final threshold, and walked back down the hallway, carrying the past like a wound that never healed. In the dim light of late afternoon, Cal found her sitting by the window legs, curled beneath her in the armchair. Lily used to love the old sketchbook, tucked tightly against her chest, like armor. Grace didn't look up when he stepped into the room. She rarely did. Her gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond the glass eyes, tracing invisible patterns in the bare trees, or maybe in her own memories. Cal stood by the doorway for a long moment, uncertain whether to speak or simply stay. He had rehearsed the words in his head, how to say he was sorry, how to ask if she remembered the lullabies he used to hum when she couldn't sleep, how to explain what had broken in him the day Lily died and why he hadn't known how to fix it. But none of it seemed right now. Not when his daughter sat so still, her silence louder than anything he could say. He stepped closer, the old floor groaning beneath his weight, and crouched a few feet away, careful not to intrude too much on her space. "Hey, Grace," he said gently, voice low, cracked. She didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn her head. Only her fingers tightened slightly around the spine of the sketchbook, and he noticed how worn it had become. Edges, frayed corners bent a small corner of duct tape, holding the cover together. He wondered how many pages inside were filled, how many words she had drawn instead of spoken. He remembered how Lily used to say Grace saw the world in lines and shadows, how she drew what she couldn't say. He shifted, trying to meet her eyes, but they were a million miles away. "You used to show me your drawings." He tried again, softer now, as if louder might scare her farther away. Do you still draw flowers? You loved drawing the garden in spring. Grace's lips pressed tighter, her jaw clenched, still no answer. He looked down, feeling the weight of her silence settle in his chest like sand. He wasn't sure what hurt more, her not speaking, or the fact that she didn't even seem angry. It was like he wasn't even real to her anymore, just a figure she watched from behind glass, a man who used to be something, but had become no one. He stayed there for a while longer, just watching her, hoping his presence could say what words no longer could. But Grace didn't move, didn't blink, just held her sketchbook like it was the only thing left in the world she could trust. Each night after the house slipped into its familiar hush and Evelyn's footsteps faded down the hallway, Cal would return to the kitchen to find a single drawing resting on the old wooden table, always placed at the exact center, like an offering left in silence. The first time it happened, he hadn't expected it. He had entered the room for a glass of water, only to freeze when his eyes fell on the paper, a pencil sketch delicate and detailed of the back porch with 2 empty rocking chairs. One chair had a teacup resting on its arm, the other was missing a leg. It hit him like a ghost. The next night, another drawing appeared, a child's hand reaching for a doorknob too high to grasp. After that, it became a ritual. Every night without fail, Grace would leave a new piece, never signed, never explained, but always aching with meaning. Sometimes they were literal, a wilted flower, a shattered window, a lone bird with its wings folded tight. Other times they were abstract, strange, and dreamlike, scribbled spirals inside heavy boxes, a figure with no face standing under rain. Cal never mentioned them aloud. He didn't want to break whatever fragile thread she was offering. Instead, he began to study them, sitting at the table for long minutes, trying to understand the language his daughter had created for herself in place of words. He realized she was telling him things he had no right to ask for directly, memories, emotions, fears wrapped in graphite and shadow. It was her way of speaking, of reaching across the chasm he had created when he left. And though she never appeared while he studied the drawings, he sometimes sensed her presence watching from the stairwell or behind a cracked door. One night the sketch was of a man sitting alone at the same kitchen table, his head in his hands. The shading around his figure was dense, almost violent. It was unmistakably him. He stared at it for hours, fingers tracing the lines she had drawn, not daring to cry, because crying might make it real. The drawings were quiet confessions, nightly whispers from a child who had been mute for 9 years, but had never stopped speaking. Cal began to wait for them more than for sleep, more than for peace. They were proof that she still saw him, that some part of her still wanted to be heard. One chilly morning, as the sky outside turned a pale gray, and the house creaked with the weight of silence, Cal found Miss Evelyn standing by the sink, drying a cracked porcelain plate with slow, methodical care. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could tell from the slight tightening of her shoulders that she had heard him coming. He lingered near the counter, unsure of how to begin, until she finally spoke, her voice, soft, worn, carrying the weight of years lived in rooms filled with unspoken things. She used to talk all the time, you know, Evelyn said, placing the plate carefully into the cupboard as if afraid it might shatter from the memory alone. Grace. That child had a mouth on her. Questions, stories, songs. She'd follow me around, asking why eggs were white but turned yellow when you scrambled them, or how the moon knew to change shape. Cal stood still, the words catching in his throat. She'd chatter to the garden, the cat, her dolls. And Lily. Always Lily. They had their own little world full of made-up words and silly games. Sometimes I'd watch the two of them lying in the grass making pictures out of clouds, and Grace would be talking a mile a minute, narrating every shape, every thought that passed through her head like it was too big to keep inside. Evelyn paused, reaching for another dish, but her hands trembled slightly now. Then the day Lily died, she stopped. Cal looked at her, truly looked, and realized for the first time how much this woman had carried. I mean, completely stopped. Not a whisper, not a hum. It was like someone flipped a switch inside her. She sat by Lily's bed that morning holding her hand, and when the nurses came to take the body, Grace didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even blink. Just walked upstairs and closed her door. She hasn't said a word since. The room felt colder. Cal pressed his palm to the counter to steady himself. Evelyn turned her gaze steady now. She didn't just lose her mother, Cal. She lost her voice. And not just the one in her throat, the one in her soul. You want her to talk to you again? Don't ask her to. Make her feel safe enough that one day maybe she won't have to draw it anymore. Then she walked past him, leaving the weight of truth in her wake like dust in the air. That night, as the house surrendered to darkness and silence reclaimed every corner, Cal sat alone in the old rocking chair on the porch, its wood groaning beneath his weight, like an old friend reluctant to welcome him back. The moon cast a pale blue light across the cracked boards, illuminating dust motes and memories he wished he could erase. In the quiet, he heard only the wind and the occasional creak from inside. Maybe the house settling, maybe Grace moving softly upstairs. He didn't know anymore what was real and what was guilt whispering in his ears. His hands trembled as he reached for the small tin of tobacco he hadn't touched in years, only to shove it away again. It wasn't the habit that haunted him. It was the reason he'd left. The truth was uglier than he liked to admit when Lily died. He didn't just lose his wife, he lost his courage. He buried her in the cold November ground, and when the mourners left and the casseroles spoiled on the counter, Cal packed a single bag and drove away. No explanations, no goodbyes, just absence. He remembered Grace just 2 years old, wearing Lily's old sweater sleeves rolled up, clutching a plastic cup of juice in both hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She hadn't cried. Not once. But he had. Not in front of her, of course. He waited until the truck turned past the edge of town, until the signs blurred, and the guilt rose like bile, and then he cried like a child himself. Coward, he thought now, his jaw-clenched nails digging into the wood of the armrest. Who leaves a child like that? Who walks away from a daughter who just lost her mother? He told himself for years that it was mercy that he was broken, that Grace was better off with Miss Evelyn, that silence was safer than shouting. But now, seeing her again, still fragile, mute, he realized the damage hadn't been spared. It had just been delayed. He hadn't protected her. He had abandoned her. And now every attempt to speak, to step forward, felt like a trespass. She looked at him like a stranger, because that's what he had become. Not a father, not a guardian, just the ghost of a man who left. It was nearly midnight when Cal walked past the kitchen table and noticed something different, barely visible beneath the soft glow of the hanging bulb. A single sheet of paper lay where there had been none earlier. Grace's nightly sketches had become the only rhythm in the house since his return, a silent ritual he didn't fully understand, but waited for, like a man waiting for rain in a drought. Each night a new drawing appeared, quiet offerings left without ceremony. But tonight's felt heavier before he even saw it. His breath caught before he reached for it. The paper was thicker, older, its edges slightly curled. When he picked it up, the charcoal smudged his fingers, and what he saw froze him in place. It was a simple scene, drawn with the soft, blunt strokes of a child, but laced with the kind of emotion words rarely captured. It was him, Cal, standing at the edge of the gravel driveway, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, truck door open mid-step. His posture was rigid, face tilted away, the outline of his body jagged and tense. Behind him stood a tiny figure barely up to his waist, a little girl in an oversized sweater, her arms stiff at her sides, 2 streams of charcoal tears running down her face. The only color on the page was a faint smudge of red crayon on the child's cheeks, raw, flushed, abandoned. There were no words, no speech bubbles, no labels, but Cal understood it instantly. This wasn't a memory he had shared with her. This wasn't a moment they had spoken of. But she had seen it, every detail, every crack in his voice, every lie he told himself that she was too young to remember. She had remembered. Not just the act of him leaving, but the silence it carved into her. The expression on the child's face in the drawing part, sorrow part, disbelief hit harder than any accusation. It was the soundless cry of someone who had been left without explanation. And Cal, for the first time since returning, saw it not from the rearview mirror but through her eyes. His own daughter standing in the doorway, unseen and unheard, as her world collapsed in one final footstep. He dropped the drawing. His hands shook. The guilt he thought he had buried deep enough had just clawed its way back to the surface through the quiet truth of a little girl's sketch. The door creaked open with a sound too loud for the moment, as if the house itself resisted his presence. Cal stood frozen for a breath, then stepped inside the room that hadn't changed in 9 years, the air thick with stillness and something harder to name. Dust hovered like mist in the soft light bleeding through faded curtains, and the scent hit him first, a mixture of old lavender-worn paper and time. The same scent that once clung to Lily's scarves and pillows and skin. Nothing had been touched. The quilt she had sewn patch by patch lay undisturbed atop the bed, its colors muted but intact, a silent testimony to a life interrupted. Her favorite book still rested open on the nightstand spine, cracked to the chapter she never finished. A hairbrush, still threaded with strands of her auburn hair, sat next to a cracked bottle of perfume. The mirror across the room, smudged with age, reflected a man Cal barely recognized, tired, older, softer in the face, but heavier in the eyes. He stepped closer, his boots leaving ghost-like imprints in the carpet where no one had walked in nearly a decade. The chair by the window, the one she used to sit in during her final days. Blanket wrapped around her knees, watching the garden sway, was still angled slightly toward the light, as if she might return at any moment and pick up where she left off. Cal reached out and touched the windowsill, half expecting to feel warmth, but the wood was cold and slightly warped. He could hear his own breath, shallow and careful, like he was afraid to disturb a ghost. Every corner of the room whispered her name, from the framed photo of Grace as a toddler to the cracked teacup resting on a coaster that still bore the watermark of her last drink. He closed his eyes and let the silence wrap around him. This wasn't just a room. It was a time capsule, a sacred freeze frame of a life that had ended, and a pain he had run from. He had imagined it would hurt, but he hadn't known it would feel like this, like walking barefoot across a memory too sharp to forget. And yet, he didn't move. For the first time in years, he let himself grieve not just for Lily, but for the part of himself he buried with her. It was tucked away beneath her pillow, just as she used to keep it, a small leather-bound journal, edges worn soft by fingers long gone. Cal's hands trembled as he lifted it, the weight of the book far heavier than its physical form. He hesitated, brushing a layer of dust from the cover with the sleeve of his shirt, then slowly opened to the first page. Her handwriting met him like a voice he hadn't heard in years, elegant, looping, unmistakably Lily's. The pages chronicled small details of ordinary days, the way the light touched Grace's cheeks when she laughed, the wildflowers that bloomed early that spring, how Cal used to hum old songs while fixing the porch rail. Each entry was a love letter folded into the rhythm of life and loss, a quiet map of a woman holding her family together, even as her body betrayed her. He turned page after page, hearing her again in every sentence, the echo of her presence wrapping around his chest. As he neared the end, her writing grew shakier, as if each letter took more strength than the last. The entries became shorter sometimes, just single lines. Grace didn't sleep. She's scared. Cal didn't come back today. I'm trying to stay until he returns. And then the final page. One sentence written in a wavering but deliberate hand that punched the air from his lungs. Grace will need you. Don't leave her like you left me. Cal froze, eyes locked on the ink that had outlived the woman who wrote it. The room blurred, his throat tightened, and all the excuses he had built like armor over the years cracked wide open. She had known. Even in her dying days, she had seen through his fear, his running, his silence. And yet she hadn't condemned him, only pleaded with him not to make the same mistake twice. The guilt burned sharper than ever, not just for the past, but for the 9 years Grace had spent waiting wordless for a father who never returned. He held the journal to his chest like a lifeline, a fragile bridge back to the man he once was, or at least the man Lily believed he still could be. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with her final hope and his last chance not to fail it. It started the morning after he found the journal with nothing more than an old rag and a bucket of warm water. Cal Dawson, a man who had spent nearly a decade running from memories, found himself on his knees in the foyer of the house he once built with his own hands, scrubbing away layers of dust that had settled like regret. The motion was simple, repetitive, but it carried weight the first time he had chosen to stay instead of flee. One by one, he moved through the rooms, wiping windows clouded with grime, collecting cobwebs from the corners, and hauling out old furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets. He didn't speak, but something in him had shifted. There was no ceremony to it, no grand announcement, just the quiet resolve of a man who realized he owed something not only to the dead, but to the living child sleeping under the same roof. He sanded the chipped banisters until the wood felt smooth beneath his fingers. He repainted the walls in muted tones, lavender in Grace's room, soft green in the hallway colors Lily would have chosen. He fixed squeaky hinges, oiled the front door, and even replaced the cracked tiles in the kitchen, remembering how Lily used to complain they tripped her when carrying a hot dish. Outside the garden was a mess of weeds and tangled vines, the once bright roses drowned in neglect. Cal knelt in the dirt and dug with his bare hands, cutting through roots and rot with the same determination that now guided his every breath. He replanted the hydrangeas Lily loved, lined the path with fresh gravel, and cleaned the little bench where she used to read to Grace in the afternoons. He didn't know if Grace would notice or if she would care, but he did it anyway, not for thanks, not even for redemption, but because rebuilding the house was the only way he knew how to begin rebuilding himself. Each nail he drove, each flower he planted was an apology spoken through action. The silence was still there, thick and ever-present, but it no longer pressed down on him like a weight. It moved with him, beside him, almost like a companion that no longer judged, only watched to see if he'd finally stay. Cal Dawson didn't believe in apologies anymore. Not the spoken kind, not after so many years of absence, not when the words felt like thin paper drifting into a fire that had already consumed too much. He had said sorry once before at Lily's funeral, in a broken whisper over her casket that no one heard but himself, and after that he left, walked away from his own daughter. No words had failed him, and so now if there was to be a reckoning, it had to be earned by something heavier than breath. That morning, before the sun lifted fully over the hills, Cal stood in the shed with a toolbox in one hand and a rusted hammer in the other fingers, curling around old weight like a man grasping at what little he still understood. The wooden swing Grace used to sit on had long since rotted. Its rope was frayed and the planks were split. He rebuilt it not from guilt, but from a quiet determination to put something back where something else had been lost. Every nail he drove into the fresh timber echoed with the ache of things unsaid. He carved her name into the side of the swing when no one was looking, not for praise but as proof that he remembered her still, even in silence. He mended the fence that bordered the yard even though the grass had grown wild beyond it, because boundaries mattered when everything else in life had once fallen apart. In the evenings when the sky flushed with dying light and the windows of the house turned gold, Cal worked on the kitchen table, sanding it smooth, removing every scar and burn mark, not to erase history, but to make it usable again. He fixed the creaking step on the staircase Grace used to trip over, re-oiled the hinges on the door to her bedroom so it wouldn't groan each time it opened, and even repaired the broken lamp in the corner where Lily once read bedtime stories. His hands bore splinters and cuts, dirt crusted under his nails, sweat streaked down his temples, but for the first time in years his body felt like it belonged to a purpose. Every movement was a form of penance. No speeches, no explanations, just action, persistent and raw, each motion a small bridge reaching toward the girl who still hadn't said a word to him. If love was to return, it would not be summoned by promises. It would be built plank by plank, gesture by gesture, until one day, maybe she'd see he never stopped being her father. He just forgot how to stay. At first it was subtle, barely more than a whisper on paper. Grace left it on the kitchen table like she always did, just after the dishes had been cleaned and the lights dimmed for the night. Her drawings were her voice, the only way she allowed herself to speak, and Cal had learned to read them as carefully as one might, a letter from someone long lost. This time, instead of the shadows and silence that had filled her earlier sketches, doors closed windows, dark figures turned away. There was something different. The paper held an outline of the house, still weary, still bruised by time, but touched by color. A window glowed with yellow. The swing in the backyard, newly rebuilt, hung not from a broken line but two strong ropes, and below it a girl sat, not smiling, but not crying either. And in the distance, near the garden beds that Cal had just begun replanting with trembling hands and aching knees, stood a man. Not faceless as he had been in so many of her past sketches, but drawn in careful strokes. Cal recognized the curve of his shoulders, the bent of his back, the old cap he always wore while working. The man in the picture was kneeling, digging his hands deep in the earth. Grace had drawn him planting something. A seed, perhaps. Hope. He stared at that drawing longer than any of the others she had left before, not because it was grand or perfect, it wasn't, but because it marked something shifting, however gently. Her lines no longer etched grief alone. They held witness to movement, rebirth. A house that had stood for years in frozen sorrow now appeared through her eyes as a place beginning again. The next night she drew the kitchen, the old table-polished chairs, pushed close a mug of coffee, and a small plate with 2 slices of toast, one for her, one for him. Then came the stairs, the creaking step now sturdy, the living room lit with warmth. Grace wasn't speaking in words, but in these scenes she began to allow herself to admit that something was changing, that her father hadn't come back only to vanish again, that maybe things broken could begin to mend not all at once, but one drawing, one breath, one act of quiet repair at a time. Word of Cal Dawson's return didn't stay quiet for long. In a town like this, where whispers travel faster than the wind, and old grudges ferment into folklore news, spreads not with curiosity, but with judgment. The first few to see him reappear at the old house didn't say a word to his face, but by dusk, murmurs floated through grocery aisles and barbershop chairs like poisoned pollen. 9 years, they scoffed. 9 years gone, and now he's sweeping porches like it means something. They didn't forget how he vanished after Lily's funeral, how he couldn't even bear to stay long enough to fold his daughter's last baby blanket or attend the unveiling of the gravestone. And now here he was, hammering shutters, planting rosemary, pretending like time hadn't turned his silence into something cruel. At the diner, a woman with hair like silver thread leaned over her coffee and said, "He's just trying to look good now." Men like him always show up when the guilt catches up, not when it matters. A man behind the hardware counter muttered, "If it weren't for Miss Evelyn, that girl would have starved." And now he wants credit for being back. Some even went as far as calling it theater, an act of redemption staged for the few who might still offer sympathy. No one seemed interested in nuance in the way grief sometimes mangled a man, until he didn't recognize his own hands. No one cared that Cal hadn't returned with banners or excuses, only with weathered skin, calloused palms, and silence thicker than the dust that once blanketed his home. The town's collective memory was unforgiving. It remembered how Grace stopped speaking the day Lily died. It remembered how Miss Evelyn kept the girl-fed clothes safe, how she marched up to the courthouse herself to keep custody from falling into the system when no father could be found. And now that Father Gaunt and Gray was trying to repaint a story everyone thought had ended in disgrace. Too little too late, someone whispered at the church steps. A man who abandons his child doesn't get to just waltz back in with a paintbrush and a prayer. Cal heard them. Maybe not all the words, but the looks, the distance, the cold nods. Every sideways glance stung. But he didn't speak in his defense. He didn't ask for understanding. He simply kept working, nailing, scrubbing, kneeling, as if redemption weren't something to be granted by others, but earned one unglamorous, back-breaking, lonely day at a time. It was a gray Tuesday morning when the knock came, sharp, official, and unwelcome. Cal opened the door with paint still under his fingernails, expecting maybe the mailman or another neighbor brave enough to disguise judgment as concern. But instead, there stood a woman in a blazer too crisp for this town, clutching a leather folder and wearing the tight-lipped expression of someone already convinced they were right. "Mr. Dawson," she said with careful formality. "I'm Margaret Hill. I'm with the county's Department of Student Support Services." Cal nodded slowly, his posture stiffening. Before he could respond, she continued, "I've come regarding your daughter Grace." Something in his chest tightened. She didn't wait for an invitation and stepped onto the porch, as if the threshold meant nothing. "We've been monitoring her case for a while now, since your departure, actually." Given her ongoing refusal to speak and the length of time she's been nonverbal, we believe she qualifies for transfer to Ashbridge Learning Center, a specialized facility designed for children with extreme emotional or developmental delays. Cal blinked, a surge of heat rising behind his ribs. "She's not delayed," he said, not loudly but with an edge that made the woman pause. "She just doesn't talk." Margaret adjusted her folder. Mr. Dawson's selective mutism can be very complex. It requires professional attention. We have speech therapists, trauma counselors, sensory regulation programs, things a home environment, especially a rural one, simply cannot provide. Cal's jaw tightened. He could see Grace just beyond the screen door, perched on the windowsill with her sketch pad. Her eyes locked on the stranger's every word, though her face gave nothing away. "We appreciate your recent involvement," Margaret added delicately, as if stepping around a landmine. "But Miss Grace has been under informal guardianship by Ms. Evelyn Harrow for years. We believe a structured, specialized setting is now in her best interest." Cal inhaled slowly. "Did you ask her what she wants?" Margaret blinked. "She doesn't speak, Mr. Dawson." "No," he said. "But she draws." The woman didn't respond to that. She handed him a packet of forms, a scheduled intake date, and a thinly veiled warning cloaked in bureaucratic kindness. "You have until the end of the month to decide," she said. "If we don't hear back, the county will move forward with placement." As she walked away, Cal didn't move. Behind him, Grace continued sketching in silence. A sunflower, a fence, a house with 2 chairs on the porch. No people, just possibility. Cal looked down at the paperwork in his hands like it was written in a language no one should ever have to learn. Cal sat alone at the kitchen table long after Margaret Hill had driven away the stack of papers she'd left behind untouched, as if signing them might finalize something sacred. He refused to surrender. The house was quiet, except for the distant creak of an old pipe and the faint scratch of Grace's pencil upstairs. Her sketchpad had become her voice, and Cal had finally begun to listen. He remembered the way Margaret had spoken with a sterile kind of authority, a clipboard full of boxes to check, not hearts to understand. "Specialized environment," she had said. "Extreme emotional delay." But she hadn't seen the way Grace hovered near the hallway when she thought he wasn't looking, how she left a drawing every night like a whispered secret placed gently on the table, hoping someone would notice without forcing her to say a word. That night, Cal stood in the doorway of her room. Grace was sitting cross-legged on the rug, her back to him, sketching a tree without leaves, but with roots that reached across the bottom of the page. He didn't speak. He sat down slowly on the floor across from her and waited. She glanced at him, then went back to drawing. "They want to send you away," he said, his voice low, almost reverent, "to some place where they think they can fix you." Grace didn't look up, but the pencil stilled in her hand. "They don't know you," he continued. "Not like I do. Not like your mama did." He took a breath heavy with old guilt and new clarity. "You're not mute, Grace. You're not broken. You're just not being heard." At that, Grace looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like weeks. There was no fear in them, no confusion, just a quiet, aching question. "Can I trust you this time?" Cal nodded slowly, as if answering a vow she hadn't spoken aloud. "You stay here," he whispered. "With me. I don't care what the papers say." He reached for her drawing, the one with the tree and the tangled roots, and laid his calloused hand over it like a promise. "You don't have to speak, Grace. I hear you." That night, he took the county's paperwork and fed it into the fireplace. Flames licked the edge of the official seal, as if devouring all the years that had tried to erase what remained. Upstairs, Grace drew a small house with 2 stick figures on the porch. They were holding hands. Neither had a mouth, but both had eyes wide open. The real enemy wasn't a person with a cruel face or a snarling voice. It was something more insidious, more invisible, stitched into the very fabric of how people thought, how they measured value, how they labeled children like Grace as damaged, defective special cases to be processed, not protected. It showed up in paperwork stamped with clinical terms in meetings where her name was reduced to a case number, and in the polite but sharp-edged language of officials who thought silence equaled absence. The system polished and procedural demanded conformity, wrapped in compassionless concern. It expected words on command, eye contact on cue behavior within the invisible rails of what was considered appropriate. And when a child like Grace refused to perform in the language, they understood the world deemed her lost. That belief didn't shout. It whispered gently, dangerously under the guise of help. She needs a controlled environment. She'll only fall behind here. Others are trained to deal with this, as if she were a problem to be handled, not a person to be known. It was a machine with smiling faces built on checkboxes and therapy timetables, its gears grinding up stories like Grace's until they came out sanitized, standardized, and missing the one thing she needed most: dignity. Cal could feel it every time someone spoke of her without asking her, every time her silence made them more uncomfortable than her grief. Every time someone flinched at her drawings because they weren't of sunshine and playgrounds, but of shadows and open doors and faceless figures. The world didn't know what to do with a child who mourned differently, who didn't cry out but folded inward, whose voice had not disappeared but chosen silence as sanctuary. That misunderstanding wasn't neutral. It was violence with clean hands. It told Grace she wasn't normal, then punished her for not trying harder to be. It convinced people like Margaret Hill that isolation dressed up as support was better than love that dared to be patient. And for 9 years, Cal had been complicit, first in his running, then in his silence. But now he saw it. The enemy wasn't just out there in policy and forms. It was in every unquestioned assumption that said different meant less. He would no longer let the world decide who Grace was allowed to be. He would fight not against a villain, but a narrative. And he would do it not with arguments or shouting matches, but with presence, one quiet day at a time. Cal cleared out the ground floor storage room slowly, like he was peeling away layers of time. Dust clung to every forgotten shelf, old coats slumped in corners like abandoned ghosts, and the faint scent of mothballs and damp wood lingered in the air. But to him, this wasn't just a cleaning project. It was an act of redemption. He wasn't making a playroom or an art studio, not a therapy space with rules and goals. He was creating something radical in its simplicity, a room where Grace could simply be. He called it the belonging room. The name came to him not in a flash, but in the quiet realization that what his daughter had been denied by him, by others, by the world, was not education or attention or resources, but a space where she was allowed to exist without expectation. This room would have no clocks, no assignments, no demands. It would not try to fix her. It would not label her. It would not speak unless spoken to. It would listen. Cal painted the walls a soft, grounding shade of sage, neither too bright nor too dull, and let Grace choose the color for the cushion. She pointed to a faded yellow in an old magazine clipping she'd left on the table without a word. He didn't question it. He hung a corkboard in one corner and left it blank. He stacked books, but not alphabetically. He filled a wooden chest with mismatched sketch pads, jars of pencils, boxes of beads, feathers, bits of string, things that didn't make sense until they were touched. A low record player sat near the window next to a pile of vinyls inherited from his father, Ella Fitzgerald Bill Evans, and one crackling tape of Lily's laughter, the only audio of her he still had. No one would be required to sit upright or speak. There were no chairs unless someone wanted one. The room was meant to soften the world, not sharpen it. It was meant to receive, not direct. When it was done, he left the door open and said nothing. For days, Grace simply walked past it, peeking in like it was a strange country she didn't trust. Then one afternoon, Cal returned from the garden to find a single drawing pinned to the corkboard, a room with yellow pillows, a lamp glowing, and a small figure curled in the corner, not smiling, not crying, just there, present. He said nothing. He only nodded, left the door open wider, and began spending his own quiet hours in that room, not as a father giving permission, but as a man learning how to stay. Every morning, just after the dew had begun to lift from the garden and the light filtered softly through the kitchen window, Cal walked down the hall and stepped into the belonging room without a word, carrying nothing but his quiet presence and whatever object his hands had chosen for the day, a worn book of poetry, a wooden stool with a broken leg, a jar of wildflowers he'd picked from the back fence line. He never called for Grace, never asked her to join him. But somehow, around the same hour, she would appear like a shadow, folding into sunlight, slipping silently into the corner with her sketchbook held close to her chest, her eyes down, her voice absent, yet her presence more eloquent than speech. Cal didn't try to make conversation. He didn't narrate his actions or explain his purpose. He read poems aloud softly and without performance, his voice low and cracked with time. Langston Hughes, Mary Oliver, sometimes verses Lily had written on the backs of old grocery lists. Some days he just hummed the sound barely more than breath. Other days he took apart old furniture, sanding the legs of an ancient chair or gluing joints back together, every motion slow and deliberate, as if the wood itself might teach him patience. He arranged fresh flowers in chipped vases without fuss or symmetry, letting them tilt however they pleased. Meanwhile, Grace would begin to draw, never immediately always, after some unspoken permission had settled into the space. Her hand moved without hesitation, sketching scenes with uncanny precision, a bird perched on the windowsill, her father bent over a broken drawer, a forgotten leaf on the carpet, catching the last of the sunlight. She never showed him the drawings. She left them behind like breadcrumbs tucked between books slid under doorways pinned to the wall of the belonging room, like silent declarations. Cal never asked questions. He only looked at them with the reverence one gives a sacred text. The room held no clocks, but somehow hours passed like breath. Time folded inward. What mattered wasn't what they accomplished, but what they allowed each other to feel presence without pressure expression, without instruction, healing, without demand. And in that quiet rhythm, Cal began to understand the language of silence not as absence but as invitation. Grace had not locked him out entirely. She was drawing a map in shadows and sketches, and every day by reading aloud, fixing things with his hands and simply staying. Cal followed that map not toward forgiveness, but toward something even more fragile and human belonging. One quiet afternoon, just as the light outside turned the walls of the belonging room a honeyed gold, Grace did something she had never done before. She didn't just sketch what she saw. She made something intentional, something personal, and left it on the table before quietly slipping out of the room. Cal didn't notice at first. He had been focused on repairing the cracked spine of an old poetry book Lily used to read, carefully gluing the threads back in place, his hands steady, but his mind wandering through memories he wasn't sure he wanted. But when he turned to collect his tools, he saw the drawing centered neatly on the wooden table, where she usually left nothing but fleeting traces. His breath caught as he looked at it. There, in fine pencil strokes, was the unmistakable image of himself and Grace sitting side by side. It wasn't detailed in the way her usual drawings were. There was a softness, a suggestion of form more than realism, but the postures were unmistakable. He was hunched slightly, as he often was when reading aloud, his hand resting on his knee. She was curled in her usual spot across from him, sketchbook in lap head, slightly tilted. But what struck Cal wasn't just the drawing itself. It was the single word written underneath in small, careful block letters. Stay. Just that. One word. No punctuation, no explanation. And yet it said more than anything she had spoken since Lily's funeral. Cal stared at it for a long time, the silence around him suddenly swelling with meaning. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was something far more sacred in its rarity and invitation. A door left ajar. The recognition that his presence mattered, that his decision to show up each day, to sit quietly, to not force healing, but simply wait, had begun to matter. Stay. It was a request, maybe even a plea or perhaps a test. But whatever it was, it rooted him deeper than guilt or grief ever had. It anchored him not to the past he couldn't fix, but to the fragile present he could still choose. Cal placed the drawing gently back on the table as if afraid it might vanish. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the overwhelming awareness that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but undeniably. The wall between them, so long cold and silent, had thinned by a single word. And he would honor that word the only way he knew how, not with promises, not with grand gestures, but by showing up again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, until stay was no longer a question, but a quiet, living truth. What Cal didn't realize at first, what sat beneath that simple, quiet drawing with the word "stay" scrawled in blocky, uneven pencil, was that it wasn't just a breakthrough or even a message of hope. It was a test. Grace, for all her silence and withdrawn stillness, was not naive. She remembered. She remembered everything. She remembered the day of the funeral, the way his boots clicked against the floor as he walked out of the house without looking back. She remembered the ghost of her mother's perfume clinging to the walls, and how quickly it vanished like her father did. She remembered waiting at first by the window, then by the door, then in her mind until the waiting hardened into something else. So when she drew that picture, when she wrote "stay," it wasn't surrender. It was a question, a dare, an emotional trap cloaked in childlike longing. And each morning when she found him in the belonging room again, just where he'd been the day before, still tinkering with a broken stool or arranging wildflowers in a cracked mason jar, she would glance at him without a word. She was watching, measuring, testing the waters for consistency. Because her wound wasn't born just from absence. It was forged in the betrayal of presence, followed by vanishing. What if he left again? What if this too was temporary? A burst of guilt, a flash of penance that would fade like the early spring snow. She couldn't afford that hope, not without proof, not without time. Cal, unaware of the full weight his daily rituals now carried, continued anyway. He didn't speak about the past, didn't offer apologies she hadn't asked for. He just stayed. Day by day, minute by minute, presence accumulating like dust layering trust into the corners of the house. But Grace's eyes, sharp, intelligent, cautious, saw deeper than the action. She was watching for the moment the pattern would break, the day the rhythm would stumble. She was watching not because she expected him to fail, but because she needed to know what he would do when the silence stretched too long, when her drawings stopped speaking, when progress seemed invisible. Would he keep coming back, or would he vanish again the moment it got too hard? That drawing, that word, "stay," was not only the beginning of trust, it was the beginning of her experiment. An experiment on love, on patience, on endurance, on whether a man who had once run could truly learn how to remain. It happened one quiet afternoon, the kind where the light slanted just right through the dusty windows, and the wind outside carried no urgency, only the sound of leaves brushing against one another like whispered secrets. Cal was in the belonging room, seated in his usual chair, an old wooden one with a soft plaid cushion he had sewn himself, reading a book whose pages had yellowed with age and memory. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and drying flowers, with the scent of cedar lingering from the beams above. Grace was in her corner, as always sketching in her notebook, her legs tucked beneath her, her head bowed with the same concentration that had become familiar. She hadn't looked at him for more than a few seconds at a time since the day she drew the word "stay." Their rhythm had settled into something steady but cautious, like two animals circling a fire knowing it could warm or burn. But that afternoon, as Cal turned a page, something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a sudden movement. It was subtler, like the softest breeze brushing against skin. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Grace rise. She didn't speak, didn't carry a drawing, didn't hesitate in the way she normally did when navigating the space between her world and his. Instead, she walked straight toward him, her steps soundless on the wooden floor the notebook left behind. Cal looked up slowly, unsure if he should move, if a single word or startled breath might shatter the moment. She came to a stop beside his chair, her small hand hanging at her side for a beat, before she reached out. And then gently she placed her hand on top of his, not grabbed it, not clung, just placed it soft, intentional, fragile. Her fingers were warm and light, her touch hesitant but certain, and it said more than any sentence she could have spoken. Cal didn't look down right away. He held still, letting the contact settle between them like a dropped pebble in still water, sending ripples through his entire body. His throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the sheer enormity of that touch. It wasn't just a hand. It was a bridge, a thread of trust, a beginning. He slowly turned his palm over, not gripping, just meeting her halfway. For the first time in nearly a decade, he felt his daughter reach for him, and this time he stayed exactly where he was. At first, Cal thought he had imagined it. The room had been wrapped in its usual hush, the kind of silence that had grown familiar between them, not empty or cold, but full like a held breath, or the quiet before rain. He was still holding her hand from the moment before, still stunned by the fragile weight of her trust. Grace hadn't moved. She was still standing beside him, her gaze not on the book in his lap or on the sketches she had left behind, but on him, directly, steadily, with a softness that hadn't been there before. Then it came so quiet it almost slipped past him like a note played from a broken violin. "Family is who hears you." The words floated in the air between them, brittle and breathtaking, like a candle being lit in a room that had forgotten what light looked like. For a second, Cal froze. His heart clenched. He didn't know whether to cry or speak or simply let the world stop. 9 years. 9 years of nothing but silence, drawings, averted eyes, the sound of pencils scratching paper instead of syllables forming breath. And then out of nowhere, a sentence that was not only her first, but a truth too deep for any child to have to carry, let alone articulate. He looked up at her, eyes wide, throat aching, but Grace didn't look away. She wasn't asking a question. She wasn't uncertain. She had spoken not because she was ready to perform or please anyone, but because she believed he was ready to hear it, that maybe she was finally being heard. Family is who hears you, not who raises you, not who shares your blood, but who listens, really listens, even when no words are spoken. Cal's fingers trembled. So many nights he had wanted her to speak, had wondered what her voice might sound like, if it would carry the same tone as Lily's, or something uniquely hers. Now he knew. It was gentle and clear, but low, like someone who hadn't practiced sound in a long time and didn't care to impress anyone, only to be real. He wanted to reply. He wanted to say 1,000 things. That he was sorry. That she was right. That he had failed her before but would never stop listening now. But instead he only nodded, slow and steady, holding her gaze with the reverence of someone witnessing something sacred. Then, with a quiet breath, she sat down beside him and leaned her shoulder against his. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was a homecoming. And Cal understood in that moment that forgiveness didn't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes it came in a whisper. Cal didn't mean to cry, but the tears came anyway, slow at first, then all at once, as if the dam of 9 years had cracked under the weight of one sentence. He didn't sob or wail. There were no dramatic gasps or theatrical collapses. It was quiet, almost reverent, like water finally finding its path through dry earth. His shoulders shook just enough for Grace to notice, but she didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't look away. She stayed exactly where she was, shoulder pressed against his gaze forward, feet tucked beneath her like roots. And in that stillness, something enormous passed between them. There was no audience. No one came rushing in to applaud or capture the moment. There were no therapists, no well-meaning neighbors peeking through windows, no streamers falling from ceilings to commemorate this fragile miracle. Just the two of them seated side by side on a faded rug in a sunlit room that Cal had once considered hollow. But now light poured in from the window, like forgiveness, soft and golden, warming the floorboards, the walls, the dust motes, dancing in the quiet. It wrapped around them like a blanket, and in that silence Cal cried, not just for Grace, but for all the things he had missed, for the funeral he had run from, for the birthdays that passed unmarked, for the silence he once thought was impenetrable but was in fact waiting patiently for him to earn his way back in. He cried for Lily, for the way she had somehow known how much Grace would need someone to stay. And he cried for himself, the man who had wasted years thinking he wasn't worthy of love, when all Grace needed was someone who stayed long enough to hear her. There was no need for words. Grace didn't try to comfort him. She didn't pat his hand or tell him it would be okay. She simply let him cry, just as he had let her stay silent all this time. They sat like that for what felt like forever, or maybe just a few minutes bathed in sunlight, anchored by quiet and bound, not by blood or obligation, but by presence. And in that moment, Cal realized something Lily had tried to tell him long ago, something he had been too broken to understand then, that healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand celebration. Sometimes it looks like a girl saying 5 words after 9 years of silence, and a man weeping not out of weakness, but because finally someone had spoken the truth aloud. There was no celebration, no parade, just a man, a child, and a room filled with light. And it was enough. The next morning the house was quieter than usual, but not the kind of quiet that once choked Cal with regret. This silence was different, gentler, fuller, like something sacred had taken root overnight. Grace had gone back to her sketch pad, the sun already filtering through the window in golden strands that lit up the dust like confetti. Cal sat nearby, still stunned by what had happened the day before. The words she spoke, family, is who hears you, echoed inside him with the weight of a lifetime. He replayed it over and over, not to prove it was real, but to hold on to the feeling it gave him, not redemption exactly, but belonging. For the first time in 9 years, he didn't feel like a man pretending to rebuild something he had destroyed. He felt like someone who had finally been invited back inside the world of his own life. But what stayed with him even more than Grace's words was how she had said them, not like a confession, not like a performance, but like a truth she had always known and had finally decided he deserved to hear. And so, while Grace quietly drew a new picture in her corner, her knees curled, her brow furrowed in focus, Cal stood and walked out of the room. Not far, just down the hall to his old tool chest. He opened it and rummaged until he found what he needed: an old wooden plank from Lily's garden box sandpaper and a half-used can of varnish. He brought it all back to the kitchen table where the morning light now spilled across the surface like a benediction. Slowly, patiently, he sanded down the wood until it was smooth. Then he picked up an old brush and dipped it into the paint that still sat open from when he'd redone the baseboards. He didn't sketch it first, didn't overthink, just painted in steady, deliberate strokes. Not in capital letters, not bold, just simple handwritten truth. It took him longer than expected. His hands were older now, a little slower, but steadier somehow. When he finished, he let it dry by the window. Grace passed by once and peeked, said nothing, just gave a small nod, like she knew what he was doing before he did. Later that afternoon, when the sun began to dip and the corners of the house turned gold and blue, Cal stepped into the room one last time, looked around at the mismatched chairs, the peeling windowsill, the vase of flowers Grace had arranged without a word, and the 2 drawings taped to the wall, one of the past, one of something like hope. Then, without ceremony, he picked up the wooden sign, walked to the doorframe, and hung it just outside. No nails, no hammer, just a small hook and his hand pressing it gently into place. The letters were a little uneven. The varnish hadn't dried perfectly, but it didn't matter, because in that moment what mattered wasn't perfection. It was presence, and the fact that someone finally had stayed. The sign read, "Where they listened." It started with one child and one quiet man who had once believed he was too late. But something in the way Grace sat cross-legged on the floor every afternoon, sketching in silence beside Cal as he trimmed flowers or read aloud from forgotten books, began to change the air in that house. It became still in the way that forests are still alive, with unseen motion, with breath and waiting. Slowly, word began to move across the town, not through any announcement or newspaper article, but in the hush of playground conversations between anxious mothers and weary teachers, in the nods exchanged between grandparents who'd run out of explanations for why their grandchild never spoke or flinched at the sound of a school bell. The whispers said there was a place, not a clinic or a center, but a room, the belonging room where children were allowed to just be. No tests, no therapies, no labels, just presence, and in a world so loud with diagnosis and expectation that silence rang like a promise. The first to arrive after Grace was Milo, a boy with tightly clenched fists and a 1,000-yard stare, who hadn't said a word since his father vanished 3 winters ago. He sat in the corner every day for a week, unmoving, unbothered, untouched. Then, one afternoon, Grace slid her sketch pad toward him, and though he didn't draw anything, he shifted his eyes to look at it. That was all. No one clapped. No one praised. But Cal noticed, and when Milo came back the next day, a box of crayons had been placed nearby without comment. Later, Ava came. Ava, who screamed when anyone got too close, who only wore yellow and communicated in high-pitched hums. Her mother, exhausted and trembling, was invited in without question. Ava lay under the windowsill for hours. No one asked her to sit upright or make eye contact. Cal simply watered the plants Grace kept drawing, and the room breathed around her. In time, Ava began lining yellow objects along the wall. Jonah obsessed with clocks, and Order began rearranging the furniture into precise patterns, whispering the time under his breath. No one stopped him. Cal brought in more chairs. Children came in waves, some loud, some withdrawn, some nonverbal, some simply misunderstood. Each brought a different rhythm, a different silence, a different storm. But the belonging room never wavered. There were no sign-in sheets, no labels taped to foreheads, just space, just acceptance, just the sacred permission to exist without fixing. Some children painted, others sorted buttons into intricate mosaics. A few simply sat and watched the sun move across the walls. And in that stillness, the unspoken language of safety unfolded. Presence replaced prescription. Attention replaced correction. The room's mismatched chairs, scuffed wooden floor, and slightly crooked windows became sacred by virtue of what they refused to demand. They did not require progress to justify compassion. They asked for nothing in return. Cal began each day by lighting a small candle, placing it on the corner table, and whispering, "You belong here," no matter who came through the door. What was once a grieving man's attempt at penance slowly evolved into a sanctuary for the unseen, the unheard, the too sensitive, the too much. Local therapists took notice not with judgment, but awe. Some sent referrals quietly, hoping the children who hadn't spoken in sessions might speak in paint or petals instead. Parents stayed. Some ended up bringing their own sketchbooks. Some sat in silence and wept. One afternoon, a teacher left a note under Cal's teacup. "They don't melt down here. They melt open." The town, once skeptical, softened. Donations began arriving: art supplies, beanbags, musical instruments. But Cal kept the space simple. No branding, no bureaucracy. Just the same crooked sign hanging outside the front door, the belonging room. Inside, children who had once been labeled as broken were simply listened to, sometimes through silence, sometimes through crayons, always through love. The room had no cure to offer, only company. And for many, that was the first miracle they'd ever known. Grace now spoke not often, not loudly, and never to fill silence. But when she did, it was with the kind of quiet certainty that made people stop mid-step, as if they were hearing the wind speak back. Her voice was soft, like someone who had spent too long storing words in a vault and was still learning which ones were safe to spend. She didn't answer every question, didn't leap into every conversation, but when she looked up from her sketchbook and said something, anything, it landed with the weight of truth. Her first words beyond stay had come slowly, stretched over days, like threads being pulled from the seams of a long-sealed coat. One afternoon, as Cal arranged wildflowers into chipped jars, Grace pointed to a crooked tulip and whispered, "That one's tired." No one laughed. Cal only nodded and said, "We'll let it rest then." Over time, her observations began to map the room, not in facts, but in feeling. "He's sad in circles," she murmured once, watching Jonah spin the cushions into loops. "Her shoes don't like each other." She commented another day, frowning at Ava's mismatched sneakers placed toe to toe, like two people forced to share a bed. She didn't need to explain. Everyone understood. Her language was not built for performance. It was built for witnessing. She never raised her hand. But when a new child came in, trembling and mute, Grace was often the one to sit nearby and say, "It's okay to be a whisper." No one taught her that. She just remembered. Grace never told long stories, but she narrated moments in ways that rewrote the room's atmosphere. When Cal tripped on a rug and laughed at himself, she blinked and said, "Even grown-ups fall funny." When a storm broke out and thunder cracked like the sky splitting open, she whispered, "The clouds are just loud today," and somehow that made the others stop flinching. Her voice wasn't constant, but it was present. It didn't seek attention, it sought connection. She still spent hours drawing in corners, still preferred to express most things in color and shape. But now words sometimes came to meet the pictures. One of her drawings of the belonging room had a single caption, "Where silence isn't empty." She never read aloud in class. She never raised her voice in crowds. But once, when a social worker came to assess whether Grace should be placed in a specialized residential program, citing her limited verbal communication, Grace stared at her clipboard and said, clear and unblinking, "You only count the words. You don't count the meaning." The woman left in silence. Grace did not speak every day, but when she did, Cal listened like he was listening to a new season arrive. Each word was a blooming, each sentence a small return. He never asked her to say more than she wanted. He never called it a miracle. But once, as they sat on the back porch watching a line of ants carry crumbs in perfect teamwork, Grace said, "They don't talk, but they still know what to do." And Cal, heart swelling, only replied, "Exactly." Grace's voice became part of the room's architecture, not its foundation, but its windows. It let in light. It did not need to be loud to be heard. It simply needed to be honored. The others noticed too. The children who had once only watched her in awe now sat closer, hoping to catch a sentence. Teachers began quoting her metaphors, slipping them into lesson plans. A visiting counselor once asked if she could meet the poet girl. Grace shrugged and said, "I just say what fits." She didn't see herself as wise. She saw herself as awake. She had learned after 9 years of silence that language was not power, it was invitation. And the world for the first time was answering back gently. Cal was no longer the man people once whispered about with a mix of pity and suspicion. He wasn't the disgraced CEO hiding from his past, nor the cautionary tale of a father who had vanished just when a little girl needed him most. He wasn't trying to be anyone's hero anymore, and he had long stopped trying to be the perfect parent he once thought he had to become in order to earn forgiveness. Instead, Cal had taken on a quieter, more enduring role, one that came without titles or applause. He became the keeper of the belonging room, not its founder, not its leader, not even its teacher, just the one who stayed. Every morning he unlocked the door and swept the floor, even when it didn't need sweeping. He adjusted the sunlight through the old lace curtains to make sure no corner was too dark or too bright for the children who found comfort in shadows. He checked every chair leg for wobble, not because anyone would notice, but because he had learned that safety often began with the smallest things. When the kids arrived, he didn't greet them with grand speeches or motivational quotes. He nodded. He smiled. He remembered their names and what kind of tea they liked. For the child who always turned left 3 times before entering, Cal waited without comment. For the one who wouldn't come inside until someone else had, he made sure he was already sitting quietly in the far corner. He read stories not to impress, but to share the room with his voice. He mended broken zippers on jackets, replaced batteries in toy flashlights, taught them how to make kites from newspaper. He never rushed anyone, never asked them to explain their silences or justify their ways of being. He knew now that staying wasn't a passive act, it was a daily decision. It was noticing when someone's eyes darted too quickly to the door and gently anchoring the moment with presence. It was sitting with a child for 20 minutes just so they could build the courage to ask for colored pencils. It was leaving the last cookie untouched because he had seen who always waited until the tray was nearly empty. Cal didn't need recognition. He didn't hang plaques or take credit when the room began to draw attention from educators and therapists curious about its impact. He politely declined every interview. When asked what his title was, he simply said, "I'm the one who stays." And that was enough. Grace never called him Dad. She didn't have to. Her way of sitting closer, of looking up when she finished a drawing, of handing him the blue crayon because she knew he liked skies, that was enough. The others followed. One boy once whispered, "He's like furniture but alive." And Cal chuckled softly. taking it as the highest form of praise. He wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. He had nothing left to prove. But he had discovered that when you commit to being the person who doesn't leave, who doesn't flinch at discomfort, who doesn't demand transformation on a timeline, that's when healing begins. Slowly, quietly, authentically. And so every day he showed up, not with solutions, not with speeches, but with presence. And in a world that often abandoned what it couldn't understand, Cal became something radical. He became the man who stayed. In a world obsessed with speed, outcomes, and perfection, the belonging room reminds us of something profoundly simple yet deeply radical. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer someone is not a solution, not advice, not even a word, but our presence. Grace didn't need a rescuer. She needed someone who stayed. And Cal, a man once lost in his own guilt, and silence didn't heal her with grand gestures. He healed by showing up every single day. This story isn't just about one girl and one man. It's about all of us. About the child in your classroom who never speaks, the neighbor who avoids eye contact, the friend who withdraws instead of reaching out. It's about how our society is so quick to label, to fix, to move on, and so slow to simply listen. But real healing, real connection doesn't come from shouting louder. It comes from creating spaces, literal and emotional, where people feel safe enough to speak in their own time, their own way. The belonging room wasn't built with money. It was built with quiet patience and the radical decision to stay. So here's the truth: you don't need to be a therapist, a teacher, or a parent to change someone's life. You just need to be someone who doesn't walk away when things get uncomfortable. Someone who sees silence not as emptiness, but as a different kind of language. If this story touched you or reminded you of someone in your life who just needs you to stay a little longer, share that in the comments. Let's build a community where presence is power. Tap save to come back when you need this reminder. And if you believe in stories that heal, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Your presence here means more than you know.